Be honest, am I overreacting? I know you've asked someone that, and I know that in the moment you asked it, you genuinely didn't know which answer would be more painful, because if they say yes, you're back to being too much, and if they say no, the thing that happened was actually as bad as it felt, and neither of those is straightforward to live with. I still ask it occasionally, and I want to be really honest about it, because I think there's a version of this conversation that would have me presenting as someone who's completely cracked self-knowledge and self-awareness and never needs a second opinion. And that would be nonsense. What's changed is that I'm very careful about who I ask, not because I need them to tell me I'm right, but actually the opposite, because I know my own patterns well enough now to know when I'm likely to be running hot and I need someone to pull me back, and when I'm actually reading something accurately and need someone to confirm I'm not imagining it. The distinction matters, and the person I ask matters enormously, because anyone whose own subjectivity, conditioning, or blind spots might colour their answer is useless to me for this particular job. They'll either talk me out of something real, or they'll hand me a false sense of justification for being, well, a bit of an arse. Before I got to that point, I was asking everyone, not selectively, just whoever was there, whoever seemed safe. And don't forget it, if things feel safe and you've got a bad model, then maybe they're not safe. But whoever I thought might tell me I was okay. And what I was really doing was outsourcing the question of whether my own experience was real to people who didn't have access to my internal data, and in some cases had a direct interest in the answer coming out a particular way. That's what this episode is about. Not just why you can't calibrate your own responses when you've grown up in a toxic environment, but what's actually happening neurologically when your responses don't come with a built-in proportionality gauge in the first place. What it looks like to slowly, imperfectly build one. I know you've been asking yourself, am I the problem? Let's find out with me, your host, Helen Villas. The experience has a very particular texture. You're in a situation, something's been said or done, and instead of just responding, you freeze into this kind of assessment loop. Is this bad enough to react to? Am I reading this right? Would a reasonable person be upset by this? The problem is that you have almost no reliable data to answer those questions with, and you've had almost no reliable data your whole life. What makes it worse is the asymmetry of it. Other people just seem to know. They respond, they move on. They don't appear to spend 40 minutes, and the rest, after a conversation running a debrief on whether their emotional response was within acceptable parameters. You've watched people get upset about things and just be upset, straightforwardly, without the meta layer, and you genuinely don't know if you're missing a skill they have, or if you were simply trained out of trusting yourself at such an early age that the self-trust infrastructure never developed properly. One direction this goes wrong is under-response, where something genuinely bad happens and you feel nothing, or you feel something so faint you dismiss it, and then 3 weeks later you're crying in the car about something apparently completely unrelated, and you eventually work out, if you're paying close enough attention, that it wasn't unrelated at all. This happened to me years ago, just after my stepfather had died, where I was taking medicine back to a chemist and I bumped into a car and I got dreadfully upset. But I wasn't upset about bumping into the car. I was upset about my stepfather dying, but hadn't been able to feel and process and react to it in real time. It's really common. The other one is over-response, where something comparatively minor happens and the feeling that comes with it is enormous, out of all proportion to the situation, and you know it's out of proportion. You can see it, which doesn't make it smaller, it just adds shame on top, like whipped cream and a cherry. And if you grew up with a parent who was toxic, both of those patterns were used against you. The times you didn't react became evidence that you were cold or didn't care, and the times you overreacted became evidence that you were unstable or dramatic. There was no response that was right, which meant you learned, very efficiently, that your responses weren't a reliable guide to anything. You learned to look outside yourself for information about whether what you were feeling was legitimate. I did this once with what are they called? Windscreen wipers. I used to drive along in the rain. I'm sure if you've heard me speaking before, you'll have heard me talk about this, that I would only know that I was all right to turn on my windscreen wipers because other people had their wipers on. It wasn't bad enough for me to not be able to see. I needed other people to know to be using their windscreen wipers for me to feel that it was legitimate to use mine. That's a slightly more external thing than emotional responses, but it's a similar thing too. That's the glitch. Not that you have big feelings or a flat effect, but that you have both without a reliable internal compass and with a very well-trained habit of outsourcing the assessment of your own emotional responses to other people, many of whom have historically had an interest in telling you you're wrong. So what's actually happening? Because there are a few genuinely separate things going on, and they're worth pulling apart, because understanding which one is operating at any given moment is actually the beginning of being able to do something about it. Start with the ADHD piece, and specifically what's called emotional dysregulation, which is one of the most under-discussed aspects of ADHD and one of the most disabling in daily life. There's a researcher, you will know that I think of him as the godfather and grandfather of ADHD, Russell Barkley, who has spent a considerable part of his career arguing that emotional dysregulation should be a core diagnostic feature of ADHD rather than an associated feature. And the evidence he's drawing on is pretty compelling. What's happening neurologically is that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for inhibiting impulse and moderating response, is underactive in ADHD brains. That's the bit that takes a feeling and runs it through a kind of proportionality check before it comes out. In a neurotypical, I hate that word, I'm going to have to find something different, brain, that moderation process is largely automatic. In an ADHD brain, it's slower, it's less reliable, and under stress, it can effectively stop working altogether. What this means in practice is that when something happens, the emotional response arrives at full volume before the moderating process has had a chance to even wake up and have coffee, and do anything about it. The feeling isn't too big because you're unstable or dramatic. It's too big because it's arriving faster than the system that would normally size it appropriately. And then because you've learned to be suspicious of your own responses, what you often do is suppress it, push it down, try to get the volume under control before anyone sees it, which works for a while and then doesn't, which is how you end up crying about something that seems from the outside completely disproportionate. The term that gets used in ADHD communities for this is rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which is specifically the way this plays out around perceived rejection or criticism. You will know if you see me on socials, I find this very difficult because it is not a thing. The rejection sensitivity is, but dysphoria, no. That's not a disorder, that's learning. The sensitivity is a reasonable response to an unreasonable amount of negative feedback, and the fact that it now fires in contexts where the threat is smaller doesn't make it irrational. It makes it calibrated to the wrong environment. When it gets labelled dysphoria, it pathologizes a healthy, if incredibly painful, safety mechanism that protected you. And worse, in my opinion, it implies unmanageable, and that just isn't true. When you start building identity, healing wounds, learning to trust yourself, the sting of rejection gets quieter. And whilst one sample doesn't equal proof, and you know how scientific-based I am and how evidence-based I am, but I'm going to share it anyway, I'd have identified with the RSD label once too. I'm very glad to say not anymore. Now I genuinely welcome rejection, treat it as learning. I don't take it personally or grow from it, ideally more than one of those. When you say you have RSD, you say you have no power over it. You literally disempower yourself. But there really is a life that can be lived where rejection glances instead of blows. And while we're here, I want to say something about what emotional dysregulation actually means. Because the word dysregulation has a way of kind of making people think that it means unhinged or unstable, and that's not it. What it means in the context of ADHD is that the emotional range is wider, the bandwidth is bigger. The highs are higher, the lows are lower, and the speed of travel between them is faster than in people without ADHD. That's not crazy, It's not a character flaw, it's just a broader emotional register running on hardware that processes feeling before the moderating system has caught up. Which means that when something hits, it hits fully. And when something is joyful, it is genuinely joyful. And when something is painful, it's genuinely painful. And all of that is real. It's just arriving at a volume and a speed that the world around you wasn't expecting, including you perhaps, and didn't know how to accommodate. The autistic piece is different, and conflating them produces advice that doesn't help either population. Autistic emotional processing involves alexithymia, which we talked about in episode 1, the difficulty identifying and describing your own emotional states, and has a different processing timeline. Autistic people very often process emotional responses more slowly than people without autism. The feeling doesn't arrive immediately, it arrives later, sometimes significantly later, sometimes in a completely different context. This is sometimes described as a delayed emotional response, and it creates a specific problem for calibration. If your emotional response to something doesn't arrive until 3 hours after the event, or 3 days even, it's genuinely difficult to connect it back to the thing that caused it in the first place, which makes it very hard to assess whether or not it's proportionate. There's also a quality to autistic emotional experience that people describe as all or nothing. The feeling is either fully present or it isn't, without much of a middle register. This can read from the outside as flatness followed by seemingly unpredictable intensity, and this is a processing difference, not an emotional deficit and not instability. It's just that the internal landscape has a different topography. So you potentially have the ADHD fast arrival, high volume response, and the autistic delayed all or nothing response. And in ADHD people, these can coexist in ways that are genuinely bewildering, where sometimes you get the ADHD spike and sometimes you get the autistic delay, and sometimes you get both, which is its own special experience. Now, here is where the toxic family background comes in, and why this particular combination is so devastating. Gaslighting, as a pattern, targets exactly this system. It works by introducing doubt into your perception of your own experience, by consistently telling you that what you felt, saw, heard wasn't real, or wasn't what you think it was, or was your fault, or was an overreaction. For people without ADHD or autism who have a secure attachment history and a well-calibrated emotional response system, gaslighting is deeply destabilizing. But there are enough internal reference points to push back against it. It's hard, don't get me wrong, but there's something to push back from. For someone with ADHD who is already aware that their emotional responses arrive faster and louder than those of people without ADHD, being consistently told that those responses are too much, too dramatic, too intense, too sensitive, lands very differently. Because it's confirming a fear you already had about yourself. You already know your responses feel bigger than other people's. You've already spent years wondering if that means something's wrong with you. And here is someone who is supposed to know you and care about you, love you, telling you that, yes, actually, it does mean something's wrong with you. And moreover, that the specific thing that's wrong with you is that you can't be trusted to assess situations accurately. For an autistic person whose emotional responses may arrive late, incompletely, or without clear labels, being told consistently that you're perceiving things wrong has a different but equally destructive effect. It teaches you to outsource perception. If you're already uncertain about your own internal experience, and the person you're supposed to trust is telling you that your read on external events is also wrong, what you're left with is a profound uncertainty about your own capacity to perceive accurately. Not just, I'm not sure how I feel, which is already hard enough, but I'm not sure what actually happened. And this is where the two things interact in a way that goes beyond the sum of their parts, because what a toxic parent who gaslights you is doing functionally is installing a second assessment layer that runs between your experience and your response to it. instead of experience leading to feeling leading to response, you get experience, then assessment of whether you're perceiving it correctly, then assessment of whether your feeling is proportionate, then a decision about whether you're allowed to act on it. And by the time you've run through all of that, you've either frozen or you've suppressed the feeling entirely, or you haven't suppressed it and now it's bigger than it was. And all of this is happening fast because your ADHD prefrontal cortex is trying to moderate a feeling that arrived faster than it can manage, while also running this anxiety spiral about whether the feeling is legitimate. That's what's happening. It's not a character flaw or a perception problem. It's a specific set of mechanisms producing a specific result, and it got installed early enough that it feels like just how you are. The difference between a response that's disproportionate and a response that doesn't look proportionate from where someone else is standing matters, and the two are not the same thing. A feeling that arrives fast and big is not automatically wrong. A feeling that arrives late and seems unconnected is not automatically wrong. Your ex or your parent or your sibling or your friend or whoever is telling you that you're overreacting is not evidence that you're overreacting. It's evidence that someone said that to you. Whether they were right is a separate question, and one that requires you to have access to your own internal data, which is exactly what this pattern disrupts. There's a concept in psychology called emotional invalidation, simply the experience of having your emotional response rejected or dismissed by someone important to you. And the research on it is pretty clear that consistent emotional invalidation in childhood produces exactly the kind of calibration problems we're talking about. Difficulty trusting your own responses, hypervigilance to other emotional cues, difficulty identifying what you feel, and a baseline assumption that your emotional experience is suspect until confirmed externally. This is what the literature says happens to people who've had this experience, and it maps precisely onto what you're describing when you say you can't tell if you're overreacting. The cruelty of it is that the people who do this are often very good at pointing to your ADHD or autism as evidence for the case. You always do this. You know you're sensitive, or this is exactly what I mean, referencing some previous incident where your response was demonstrably too big for the situation, in their opinion. Well, they're not entirely wrong that the responses sometimes don't match the situation. What they're doing is using a real thing, your genuinely non-standard emotional processing, as a weapon to prevent you from trusting yourself at all. If you want to go much deeper on the neuroscience of emotional dysregulation, and specifically why the standard advice around regulation often doesn't work for ADHD and autistic nervous systems, I've done a companion episode on Is This a Thing? My paid-for episodes you also get included in Hub memberships. It gets into the actual evidence on what does and doesn't work for nervous systems like ours. If you're a Hub member, it's there now, and if you're not, I'll put the link in the show notes. If this episode landed for you and you want a safe, supportive space with people who just get it, join the Hub at liberationacademy.co.uk, where you'll get early access to Am I the Problem and Is This a Thing, along with courses, live calls, and a community of people who have, at minimum, read all the same books you have and are also still figuring it out. If you've been considering it, the link is in the show notes. Whew, this one is genuinely hard to rewire because the pattern is so deeply embedded, and because it's sort of involves learning to trust something, your own perception, that has been systematically undermined. That takes time. And I'm not going to tell you there's a quick fix because there just isn't. And you've been told enough things that have turned out not to be true. What I can tell you is where to start. And the starting place is not with big moments. Not the moment when you're in the middle of a conflict and you genuinely cannot tell whether you're right or you're catastrophizing. The big moments are the wrong place to build this skill because your nervous system is already dysregulated. ADHD prefrontal inhibition is compromised, and if there's another person involved who is actively contesting your perception, you have too many variables. You'll lose the thread every time. The place to start is in low-stakes situations where nothing much is at play. And the practice is really actually deceptively very simple, which is that instead of asking, is this response proportionate, you notice the physical signal, Before you assess it, before you run it through the tribunal of people who have their own agendas, you just register that there is a physical change happening somewhere in your body. Your jaw has tightened, or there's something in your chest, or you've gone slightly cold, or your attention has narrowed. I can sometimes get it like a floaty feeling, almost like I'm disconnected from my body, not like disassociation, just a jarring of myself, like I'm not quite all in the right order. You don't have to name it as an emotion. You don't have to categorize it. You just have to notice that your body has registered something. If you have alexithymia, this is the way in, not through labeling the feeling, but through noticing the sensation. This is grounded in interoception research. And what the research suggests is that you can improve your ability to read your own emotional states by improving your connection to the physical signals that precede them. And this is learnable, not fixed. Even if your baseline interoceptive awareness is lower than average, which for a lot of people with ADHD or autism, it is. And this doesn't require visualization. If you can't generate mental images, this practice still works because it's entirely body-based. You're attending to what's physically there. Once you've got that even loosely in place, the next piece is building what I'd call a kind of personal baseline, not from a feelings wheel or a worksheet, but from your own data about how your responses tend to run. If you have ADHD, emotional dysregulation, you know that your responses arrive fast and big. That's not a flaw in the data, it's a feature of your particular data set, which means when a big response arrives, you're not necessarily overreacting. You're running on fast arrival hardware. You're like Concorde compared to a little twin-engine plane. If you have autistic, mind you, is the analogy of Concorde bad? See, there you go, there's a spiral. Never mind. If you have autistic delayed processing, you know that sometimes the feeling will come later, and that the fact that it's come later doesn't make it wrong or disproportionate. Both of those things are just your system doing what your system does. This connects to something that took me an embarrassingly long time to work out for all my training, therapy, and knowledge on this mechanism. It can still catch me out sometimes, especially if I'm tired, feeling vulnerable, or my cognitive load is high. So quite a lot of the time, to be honest. But the thing I eventually landed on is that proportionality isn't actually the right question. The question isn't, is this response the right size? The question is this response telling me something real? A response can be large and still be telling you something real. A response can be disproportionate to the immediate situation and still be accurately flagging a pattern. Your ADHD emotional system is fast and loud, but it's not wrong just because it's loud. You don't have to win the argument about whether your response was proportionate or convince the person who's telling you that you're overreacting. What you're trying to do is build a read on yourself that doesn't require someone else to confirm it before you'll accept it, so that even when you can't be certain whether you're right, you're not automatically defaulting to the assumption that you're wrong. The default blame position, I call that. And I do want to say something about reality checking with other people, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that asking someone else's opinion is automatically self-abandonment. It obviously isn't. There's a meaningful difference between outsourcing your self-trust to whoever's available because you have no internal reference point at all, which is where a lot of us started, and choosing to check in with a specific person you trust precisely because you do have a working sense of your own patterns and you know when you are likely to be off. I still do the latter, as I said. When my response feels big and I'm tired or my cognitive load is high, I will go to one of a very small number of people, 2 or 3 maximum, to be straight with me. Not because I can't trust myself at all, but because I know enough about my own system to know when it might be running hotter than the situation warrants. You know, I could be projecting. I could be reading something into what's happening that isn't there because of my history, and I know that about myself. So I check it out, and having someone I trust confirm or challenge that is useful, not weak. The difference is in who you're asking and why. If you're asking because you genuinely cannot tolerate your own uncertainty and you need external confirmation before you'll allow yourself to feel anything, That's the old pattern. If you're asking because you have a working hypothesis about your own response and you want an honest second opinion from someone whose judgment you actually trust, that's just good epistemics. The goal isn't to never need anyone. It's to build enough of an internal baseline that you can tell the difference between those two things. For people with ADHD specifically, because working memory and the passage of time both work against you, it's worth keeping some kind of record. Not a detailed journal if that's not something you'll sustain, guilty, but a note or, like even a voice memo in the moment or shortly after that captures what happened and what you noticed in your body, not your assessment of whether it was right, just what was there. Over time, that data is genuinely useful because it lets you see patterns in your own responses that you can't hold in working memory long enough to identify in real time. For autistics processing specifically, where the emotional response may come later, the useful practice is to not force it. If the feeling isn't there yet, it isn't there yet. And trying to manufacture a response so that you can assess it in the moment is just adding another layer of performance on top of an already complicated system. Give it time. The response will come when it comes, and when it does, it's still valid data, even if it arrives 3 days after the event. One of the things that comes up a lot in the work I do around emotional dysregulation is how badly it translates into professional environments. Not because the responses are wrong, but because workplaces are generally not built with fast arriving emotional responses or delayed processing in mind. And the result is that a lot of very capable people look on paper like they're not coping, when what's actually happening is a mismatch between how their brain works and what the environment is asking of it. Apereo Profiles is what I've built to do something about that. It's a cognitive and personality profiling service that maps out how you actually function, your executive function patterns, your processing style, how you perform under different kinds of pressure, and it comes with practical recommendations that are specific to you. Not a diagnosis, not a personality quiz, something considerably more useful than either. It's for individuals who want to understand themselves better in professional contexts and for managers and HR teams who want to actually support their people rather than just accommodate them on paper. If that's relevant to you or your organisation, the details are in the show notes. Right. Here's the uncomfortable bit. At some point, knowing all of this has to become something other than a very sophisticated explanation for why you can never trust yourself, because that's the trap of this particular pattern set. It's a trap I've fallen into myself, and I suspect you recognize it. You learn enough about your own neurodivergence and your own history to build a very thorough and very accurate account of why your calibration is broken, and then you use that account as a reason to perpetually defer the question of whether your responses are real. The explanation is true, the mechanisms are real, and the history is real. And none of that changes the fact that at some point you have to start making calls based on your own data, even imperfect data, even fast arriving or delayed or unlabeled data. You have to start treating your own perception as a working hypothesis rather than a defendant who needs to prove innocence before being allowed to have opinions. Because the alternative, the indefinite suspension of self-trust pending sufficient evidence, is just a more internally generated version of the same gaslighting pattern. You're doing the work your toxic parent used to do. And I say that not to make you feel guilty about it, because it makes complete sense that you'd internalize it. It's what brains do with patterns that got installed early. But because you need to hear that the thing you're doing when you run the tribunal is not neutrality, it's not intellectual rigor, it's self-abandonment. And you've had enough of that from other people without adding yourself to the list. So that's episode 2. Next week, we're talking about the apology reflex, the reason just stop apologizing is genuinely useless advice, and what's actually happening when you apologize for taking up space. Before that episode drops, I'd love to know, what's the thing you apologize for most that you know somewhere you don't actually need to apologize for? Hi, lampposts. You can tell me on Instagram or through the form in the show notes, and I'll be reading everything, even if I can't respond to all of it. Thank you, as ever, for listening. And again, as ever, All that remains to be said is take care. Bye.